And Kathryn Rooney Vera, head of global macro and chief investment strategist over at BLOOMBERG Capital Markets. Kathryn, always great to see you. Let's start with Jerome Powell. What did you make of his comments this week?
And they precipitated this inflation scare, which took, of course, treasuries to 175 and probably soon to ascend even further given the lack of extension of the SLR exemption. So I was actually kind of surprised. I thought of all the options remain, I thought extending the exemption, the regulatory exemption past March 31st would be the easiest. Because if not, if you get any disincentive to purchase treasuries, which is effectively what the expiration does, then it just leads to additional upside pressure on 10-year treasury yields, possibly leading the Fed to have to choose an alternate track, such as, yield caps or Operation Twist or simply outright purchases. So that's what I think has been the most, I've been most attentive to this week.
Talk to us about the tick up in yields and how you are thinking about the Fed having control over those. Did the message come loud and clear via the bond markets?
The bond market hasn't yet fully priced in how grave a threat, in my view, inflation is. This is something that we've been talking about Tick research before it was really headline. About 6 months ago, we considered the combination of pent-up demand and the velocity of the vaccination process leading to some demand pull inflation from the fundamental economic side, exacerbated, of course, by multi-trillion dollars in fiscal stimuli, as well as additional monetary stimuli. What we've seen so far is M2 growing at 25%, M1 growing at 75% year over year, and M1 base money, 40% of total M1 base money has been created over the past 12 months. So these are astronomical numbers that I think the market is just starting to price in. What we have to take into consideration, I think Lyle Brainard is really on the front lines of this over at the board of governors at the Fed, is the impact that this has on the cost of financing. What they least want to see, in my view at least, is to see a 100 basis point jump in 10-year treasury yields as we've seen since October, and the impact that that has on the cost of financing, not just for mortgages, which go up by 80 basis points for every 100 rise in the 10-year treasury, but consumer lending as well as private business lending.
I am curious in there, Kathryn, because a lot of people, we talk about sort of the patience that Powell seems to be exhibiting with regards to waiting for the labor market to reach the threshold that he wants to see before he starts thinking about raising rates. But now you have a market here that seems to be already pricing in those higher borrowing costs. You have some concerns here about financial conditions and whether those borrowing costs would actually lead to some deterioration. I'm wondering less about whether Powell gets pushback from the markets. Does he start at all to get pushback from his own members on the committee?
Well, there's always hawks and doves, and you do hear different disparate voices within the committee. But it does seem to be that there's general consensus, which is true on the lack of near-term inflationary pressures. The question I think we have to ask ourselves is, at what point does the Fed consider itself content with inflation, with the inflation rate? We know that the 2% is no longer a target, but an average. So does that mean that core PCE can touch 3.5%? 4% before the Fed moves? I think the Fed has to be very careful, and the market could jump ahead of the Fed if inflation expectations get out of control. They're very hard to regain once they get, very flighty. So I think that the Fed has to be very careful with its prolonged, zero interest rate policy forever stance. I really liked a piece on Bloomberg actually this week by Macroman that talked about, Jay Powell being the bizarro Volcker. I thought that was very, very interesting and funny.
Yeah, it's making us revisit Volcker. And of course, I just finished Sebastian Mallaby's book on Greenspan, all about those inflation dynamics, right, and how to control the narrative via the news and the market. So, Kathryn, I'm right there with you. Talk to us quickly, just given that you are global investment strategist, the dollar strength that we've seen recently, does that continue?
Yeah, I think that in bouts of risk aversion, it certainly does. But my structural view over the medium term is for dollar weakness and strength in the emerging space. So I am recommending from now through year end accumulation of positions in international markets, specifically in emerging Asia as well as Latin America, where there is still value to be had. And I think a lot of those currencies especially are massively undervalued.
Kathryn Rooney Vera, head of global macro and chief investment strategist at Bull Capital Markets. Thank you so much for joining us.